Declined. The word, spoken by the waitress with a sharp edge of impatience, sliced through the low murmur of the cozy Italian restaurant. It was loud enough to make heads turn. A ripple of silence spread from the center of the room, where Rachel sat, suddenly feeling like she was on a brightly lit stage. A hot, prickling wave of shame washed over her face, so intense it felt like a physical burn. She stared down at the useless piece of plastic in her hand, her own name on it feeling like an accusation. All she had wanted was one night of peace, one small reward after a brutal double shift at the hospital, followed by another 6 hours on her feet at the coffee shop, just a single plate of pasta she didn't have to cook herself in a warm, inviting place that smelled of garlic and basil. Now, that simple pleasure had curdled into a public nightmare. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Could you try it again, please?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The waitress sighed, a theatrical sound of annoyance, and snatched the card. She ran it through the machine with a flourish. The small screen flashed its cruel red verdict once more. "Declined," the waitress repeated, even louder this time, as if Rachel were deaf as well as destitute. The whispers started then. A low, venomous hiss that slithered around her. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her, some filled with pity, which was somehow worse than the open contempt in others. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. Desperate, she began to fumble in her worn handbag, her fingers searching frantically for loose change, for a crumpled bill, anything to make this stop. The lump in her throat was so thick she could barely breathe. "I'm so sorry. I don't understand. It should have worked," she stammered, not to the waitress, but to the silent, judging audience around her. It was in that moment of absolute, soul-crushing humiliation that a voice emerged from the shadows. It was a man's voice, low and calm, yet it resonated with an authority that cut through the whispers and silenced the entire room. It came from the darkest corner table, a place she hadn't even noticed. "She's with me." Every head in the restaurant swiveled toward the source of the voice. A man was rising from the corner table. He was tall, dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit that seemed to absorb the light around him. His presence was a force of nature, a quiet storm of power that commanded instant respect. Rachel had never seen him before, but she knew, with a primal certainty, that he was someone important. He moved with a silent, deliberate grace, walking not to her table, but directly to the cashier's counter. He didn't even ask for the bill. He simply pulled a crisp, $100 note from his wallet and placed it on the counter. "Keep the change," he said, his voice too low for the room to hear, but the finality of the gesture was unmistakable. Then he turned. His gaze fell on her, and the entire world seemed to narrow to the space between them. His eyes were the color of dark, aged whiskey, intense and utterly indecipherable. They held no pity, no judgment, only a calm, unnerving focus. He was looking at her as if he were the only other person in the room. He gestured with his head toward the now empty chair at his corner table. "Sit," he said, not a question, but a soft command. He paused, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Unless you'd rather stand there." Moving from her table to his felt like crossing a chasm. Every eye in the restaurant followed her, their whispers of physical force against her back. Rachel felt like a frightened animal being led into a lion's den. She slid into the chair he had indicated, the plush velvet a stark contrast to the hard wooden seat she had just left. The table was large, creating a formal distance between them, but the silence that settled was heavier and more suffocating than the judgment of the entire room had been. He simply watched her for a long, unnerving moment. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just observed, his whiskey-colored eyes taking in her flushed face, her trembling hands, the way she clutched her worn handbag in her lap like a shield. He seemed to be seeing not just her public humiliation, but every crack and fissure in the carefully constructed walls of her life. The silence became unbearable. She had to break it. "Why did you do that?" she finally asked, her voice a raw, shaky whisper that was swallowed by the vastness of the quiet. He leaned back in his chair, the movement slow and deliberate. The faint scent of expensive cologne, something clean and woodsy like cedar and rain, drifted across the table. "I dislike seeing good people mistreated," he said, his voice a low, even rumble. The simplicity of his answer was disarming, but then he continued, and a chill snaked down her spine. "The hours are long at County General," he said, his tone casual, as if commenting on the weather. "Especially for the nurses in the cardiac wing. You looked like you needed a quiet meal." Her blood ran cold. How could he possibly know that? She had her hospital ID tucked away in her wallet. She wasn't wearing scrubs. A knot of suspicion tightened in her stomach. This was no random act of kindness. This man, this stranger, knew things about her. The intrigue was a terrifying counterpoint to her fear. "I'll pay you back," she insisted, her pride stinging. "Every cent. It might take me some time, but I will pay you." He considered her, a long, thoughtful pause. "I have no doubt that you would," he said. And then, a subtle shift in his expression, a flicker of something sharp and calculating in his eyes. "But I'm not interested in your money, Rachel." He said her name. The sound of it on his lips, spoken with such easy familiarity, was another shock to her system. How did he know her name? "I have a proposal," he continued, leaning forward slightly, the intensity of his gaze pinning her to her seat. "A way for you to clear your debt immediately. I require a companion for a charity gala tomorrow evening. Someone respectable, someone from outside my usual circle." He let the words hang in the air. "Accompany me to the event, and we'll consider your debt paid in full." The proposition was so bizarre, so utterly out of left field, that she could only stare at him, speechless. A gala? With him? A man who radiated a quiet danger that made the hairs on her arms stand up? Her instinct screamed at her to refuse, to run. But the thought of being indebted to him, of having this strange, powerful man holding a claim over her, felt infinitely more dangerous. "Why me?" she finally managed to ask, the question laced with disbelief. A ghost of a smile, the first she had seen, touched the corner of his mouth. It didn't reach his eyes. "Because you're not afraid to look weak," he said, his voice dropping, becoming almost intimate. And in a world of predators, Rachel, that kind of honesty is the rarest form of strength. The next afternoon, a delivery arrived that was so out of place in the shabby hallway of Rachel's apartment building that it looked like a prop from another world. A courier, looking deeply uncomfortable, handed her a massive, glossy black box, tied with a thick satin ribbon. It was heavy, elegant, and utterly anonymous. There was no sender, no note, just her name and address printed on a discreet label. Her hands trembled as she placed it on her small, cluttered coffee table. It took up the entire surface. With a sense of both dread and irresistible curiosity, she untied the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in layers of delicate, crinkling tissue paper, was a dress. But it wasn't just a dress. It was a masterpiece. A sweep of deep sapphire silk that seemed to drink the light, with a simple, elegant cut that whispered of astronomical expense. Beneath it, tucked into their own compartment, was a pair of silver stilettos that glittered like captured starlight. The entire ensemble was worth more than 6 months of her rent. It was a silent, powerful statement. A surge of panic and anger washed over her. This was too much. This was not part of the deal. She found the small card James had given her, his name and a single phone number embossed on it, and dialed, her fingers stiff with indignation. He answered on the second ring. "Rachel." He said her name not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "I can't accept this," she said, her voice coming out breathless and high-pitched. The dress, the shoes. This is insane. I'm sending it back. It's a loan, he replied, his voice a calm, unruffled sea against her storm of anxiety. A costume for the part you're playing tonight. In my world, appearances are a form of armor. Consider it part of the job. His logic was infuriatingly sound, disarming her anger and leaving her feeling flustered and out of her depth. A car will be there for you at 7. At precisely 7 o'clock, a sleek black car, the kind she only ever saw in movies, was waiting at her curb. The driver, a man with a stony face and impassive eyes, held the door open for her. She slid into the cool leather interior, the sapphire dress rustling around her, feeling like an imposter, a child playing dress-up. She expected him to drive toward the city center, where the grand hotels and ballrooms were. Instead, he turned in the opposite direction, heading toward the affluent upper district, the part of town where the elite lived and worked. "I think you're going the wrong way," she said, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. The driver didn't answer immediately. He navigated the car through a set of ornate iron gates and up a long, winding driveway. They stopped before a gleaming glass and steel building, its entrance grand and imposing. The sign, carved into a slab of polished granite, read, Westwood Medical Institute. It was the most exclusive, state-of-the-art private hospital in the country. Rachel stared at it, her mind reeling with confusion. Why are we here? There must be a mistake. The driver finally turned his head, his gaze meeting hers in the rearview mirror. His expression was still impassive, but his voice was unexpectedly gentle. "There's no mistake, Ms. Adams," he said. "Mr. Marino arranged a consultation for your grandmother with Dr. Alistair Finch. He's the top neurologist in the country. The appointment is in 15 minutes. The world tilted on its axis. Her grandmother, her failing health, the endless waiting lists for specialists, the constant gnawing worry that was the background noise of Rachel's entire life. How? How could he possibly know? This wasn't a dress. This wasn't a gala. This was a lifeline. This was a miracle. She looked from the gleaming hospital, a temple of hope she could never have afforded, to the expensive dress shimmering on the seat beside her. The simple debt she had agreed to pay had just become a crushing, terrifying, and unbreakable bond. James Marino hadn't just bought her a meal. He was buying her life. Stepping into the grand ballroom on James's arm felt like stepping onto another planet. The air hummed with the quiet confidence of the obscenely wealthy. Light from a dozen crystal chandeliers fractured into a million pieces, glinting off diamonds and sparkling in glasses of champagne. Rachel felt like an imposter, a common brown sparrow that had somehow found its way into an aviary of exotic peacocks. The sapphire dress was her only camouflage, but it felt thin and fragile. James's hand was a firm, warm weight on the small of her back. It was not a casual touch. It was a possessive, grounding gesture, a silent declaration to the entire room. She is with me. She is mine. He guided her through the glittering crowd, his body a subtle shield between her and the curious, appraising stares. With him at her side, no one looked at her with pity or disdain. They looked at her with a burning, speculative curiosity, their eyes darting from her unfamiliar face to the powerful man who was holding her so close. There was a new emotion in their gazes now, one she had never encountered before, a subtle hint of fear. He introduced her to a few people, a senator, a tech mogul, his voice a low, neutral murmur. He simply said, "This is Rachel," and the simple introduction, backed by his formidable presence, was enough. They smiled, shook her hand, but their eyes were wary. They were trying to solve the puzzle of her, the unknown variable at the side of the city's most enigmatic power player. It was near the towering ice sculpture of a swan that they were intercepted. A man, older than James, with a florid face and an arrogant smirk, stepped directly into their path. He held a glass of whiskey, and his eyes, small and piggy, raked over Rachel with dismissive contempt. "Well, well, Marino," the man said, his voice a condescending drawl. "I see you've brought a new pet to the party. Getting tired of the usual thoroughbreds?" Rachel flinched as if struck. The insult was crude and public. A hot surge of anger and humiliation washed over her. Before she could even think of a response, James moved. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't push the man. He simply shifted his weight, placing himself slightly in front of her, and leaned in toward the man, who she now recognized from newspaper clippings as Marcus Thorne, a rival real estate developer. James's voice was a whisper, so low that Rachel couldn't hear the words, but she saw the effect of them. The arrogant smirk on Thorne's face vanished, replaced by a sudden, stark pallor. The color drained from his cheeks, and a sheen of sweat broke out on his forehead. His eyes widened with a flicker of genuine, primal fear. He stammered something, a choked, incoherent apology, and then practically fled, disappearing into the safety of the crowd. The entire exchange took less than 10 seconds. Rachel stared at James, her heart pounding. The air around them was still crackling with the residue of his silent, lethal threat. "What? What did you say to him?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of the orchestra. James turned back to her, his expression once again a mask of cool indifference. But she saw it. A slight, almost imperceptible tremor in the hand that now offered her a glass of champagne from a passing tray. It was the only sign of the fury he held so tightly in check, the only crack in his armor of control. "I simply reminded him," James said, his dark eyes meeting hers, "of the importance of good manners." The orchestra swelled, the soaring notes of a violin signaling the start of a waltz. The melody was slow, haunting, and deeply romantic. Couples began to drift toward the polished dance floor in the center of the ballroom. Rachel assumed they would remain on the sidelines, observers in this world she didn't belong to. But then James turned to her, setting his untouched glass of champagne on a nearby table. He extended his hand. "They'll expect us to dance," he said, his voice a low murmur. He framed it as a necessity, another move in their public performance. "It's part of the agreement." But his eyes told a different story. In their dark, whiskey-colored depths, she saw something that had nothing to do with agreements or expectations. It was a flicker of raw, undisguised want. Her breath caught in her throat. Her hand, as if with a will of its own, lifted to meet his. The moment his fingers closed around hers, a jolt of electricity shot up her arm. His grip was firm, confident. He led her onto the dance floor, and the glittering crowd seemed to melt away, the murmuring voices fading into a distant hum. He pulled her into his arms, one hand securely on her waist, the other holding hers. The distance between their bodies was proper, formal, but the energy crackling in that small space was anything but. Dancing with him was like being caught in the calm eye of a hurricane. The world spun around them, a blur of silk and diamonds, but in his arms there was a strange, profound stillness. He moved with an effortless, predatory grace, guiding her through the steps as if they had been dancing together their entire lives. Her body seemed to know how to follow his lead, their movements syncing in a silent, perfect rhythm. She tilted her head back to look at him, and she found him already watching her, his gaze intense and focused. The mask of the indifferent Mafia boss was gone. In its place was the unguarded expression of a man completely captivated. In that moment, under the soft glow of the chandeliers, she didn't feel like a charity case. She didn't feel like a debt being repaid. For the first time, she felt seen. She felt wanted. The feeling was so intoxicating, so dangerously seductive, that she almost missed the subtle shift in his expression. The softness in his eyes hardened for a fraction of a second, his gaze flicking to a point over her shoulder. He pulled her a little closer, his hand tightening on her waist as he continued to dance, his movements never faltering. He leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear, his warm breath sending a shiver down her spine. His whisper was a low, dangerous secret in the midst of the beautiful music. "The man in the gray suit, by the fountain," he murmured, his voice a silken threat. "He's been watching you since we arrived. He works for Thorn." A cold spike of fear pierced the warm, hazy bubble of the dance. She fought the urge to turn, to look. Suddenly, the ballroom felt menacing, the smiling faces hiding unseen threats. She had thought she was just a prop, a companion for the night. The chilling reality crashed down on her. She had become a piece in a game she didn't understand, a target in a silent war. Her body tensed in his arms. He must have felt it, because his hand squeezed hers, a firm, reassuring pressure. "Don't worry," he continued, his voice a low, absolute promise that vibrated through her. "He's watching, but he can't touch you." He spun her slowly, his eyes locking with hers again, dark and possessive. "No one can." The promise was meant to be comforting, a shield against the wolves. But as she looked into the face of the lion who held her, a new, more terrifying question bloomed in her mind. What kind of man could make such a promise and have the absolute power to keep it? The drive from the gala was a study in charged silence. The memory of the dance, the intimacy of James's arms, and the chilling reality of his warning warred within Rachel, leaving her feeling breathless and confused. She expected the driver to take her back to her modest apartment, to drop her back into her own world like a borrowed doll being returned to its box. Instead, the car bypassed her neighborhood entirely, heading toward the glittering spine of downtown. It pulled into a private underground garage beneath a sleek, impossibly tall skyscraper that pierced the night sky. "Mr. Marino is waiting for you upstairs," the driver said, gesturing toward a private elevator. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was unplanned. This was not part of the deal. But she found herself moving, stepping into the silent, wood-paneled elevator, a sense of inevitability guiding her feet. The elevator ascended without a sound, opening directly into a space that took her breath away. It wasn't an apartment. It was a garden in the sky. A massive rooftop terrace had been transformed into a secret oasis, a lush, green sanctuary floating high above the sleeping city. Wisteria vines clung to a pergola, their blossoms glowing a soft purple in the moonlight. The air smelled of damp earth, night-blooming jasmine, and the clean, cool scent of the city far below. In the center, a simple stone fountain trickled softly, its gentle murmur the only sound. James was standing by the edge of the terrace, his back to her, his tuxedo jacket gone, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He was staring out at the sprawling carpet of city lights, but he didn't seem to be seeing them. "This was my mother's," he said, without turning around. His voice was different here, stripped of its hard, authoritative edge. It was quieter, tinged with a melancholy she had never heard before. She hated the noise and the concrete. She said she needed a place where she could breathe. So my father built this for her. He finally turned to face her. In the soft, forgiving light of the garden, the formidable Mafia boss was gone. In his place was a man who looked profoundly lonely. The weight of his world seemed to be pressing down on his broad shoulders. "She was the only one who ever called me Jamie," he said, a ghost of a sad smile touching his lips. "After she died, I locked this place up. I couldn't stand to be here. It felt too quiet. Here, surrounded by the living legacy of his mother, the armor he wore so constantly began to crack. He spoke of the immense pressure of his family name, the crushing burden of protecting an empire he never asked for. He didn't speak of violence or of business, but of the profound isolation of being at the top, a king on a lonely throne, trusted by no one, feared by all. The vulnerability he showed her was a disarming gift. It made her feel safe enough to offer a piece of her own brokenness in return. She told him about the constant gnawing fear for her grandmother's health, a terror that lived in the back of her throat. She spoke of the bone-deep exhaustion of working 2 jobs, of the relentless struggle just to keep her head above water. Then, the words tumbled out before she could stop them. "I was supposed to be a chef," she confessed, the admission a quiet, painful whisper. "I was in culinary school. It was the only thing I ever truly loved. But then my grandmother got sick and the tuition— well, the hospital bills came first." James fell silent. He looked at her, his gaze intense, as if he were seeing the shape of her lost dreams. He walked to the edge of the terrace and looked down at the street far below, at a familiar corner she could just make out. "The restaurant," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Where we met. I bought it this morning." Rachel stared at him, her mind unable to form a coherent thought. "You— what?" He turned back to her, his expression serious, his eyes holding hers. "The kitchen is yours, if you want it." The offer was a lightning bolt, a sudden, brilliant flash that could either illuminate her future or burn her to the ground. It was the fulfillment of a dream she had long since buried. But it was also a chain, a beautiful, glittering chain that would bind her to him forever. A perfect, golden cage. "Why?" she breathed, the question full of a hope she was terrified to feel. "Why are you doing all this?" He took a step closer, the space between them humming with a new, fragile intimacy. "Because," he said, his voice soft and raw, "talent should never be wasted, and a heart like yours should never have to struggle." The offer hung in the cool night air of the garden, a dream so vivid Rachel could almost taste it. The clatter of pans, the scent of sizzling garlic, the creative fire she had extinguished so long ago. It was everything she had ever wanted, and for that very reason she knew she had to refuse. "No," she said, the word quiet but firm. A flicker of surprise, quickly masked, crossed James's face. "I can't accept," she continued, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. "It would just be another debt, a bigger one. I can't live my life owing you for every good thing that happens to me." She expected him to argue, to persuade her with his infuriatingly calm logic, to remind her that it was an opportunity she would never get on her own. Instead, he simply studied her, a long, silent appraisal. A slow nod was his only reply. He seemed not offended, but impressed, as if her refusal was an answer he had been testing for, and she had passed. The days that followed were strange. James did not mention the restaurant again. The fragile intimacy of the garden seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a respectful but palpable distance. But he didn't disappear. Instead, he did something far more unsettling. He began to appear in her life, a silent, watchful guardian. He would come into the coffee shop where she worked the late shift. He wouldn't order anything. He would just take a small table in the darkest corner, open a sleek, impossibly thin laptop, and work for hours. The first time it happened, her heart hammered with anxiety. But as it became a routine, his presence transformed from a source of tension into a strange, unspoken comfort. The other staff were terrified of him, giving his corner a wide berth. But his focus was always on his screen, a silent sentinel in her periphery. One Tuesday night, the bell above the coffee shop door chimed, and a ghost from her past walked in. It was Kevin, her ex-boyfriend, the man whose temper and jealousy had left bruises on both her body and her soul. He looked thin, strung out, his eyes darting around the room with a desperate, feral energy. He saw her behind the counter, and his face twisted into a sneer. "Well, well," he said, his voice loud enough for the few remaining customers to hear. "Look who's still slinging coffee. I need some money, Rachel. You owe me." He began to cause a scene, his voice growing louder, more aggressive, his words a stream of cruel, humiliating insults. Rachel froze, her body remembering the fear before her mind could. She felt small, exposed, the familiar paralyzing terror washing over her. The manager started to move from the back office, but he was too slow. Before anyone could react, a chair scraped against the floor in the corner. James rose to his feet. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He moved with a deliberate, lethal calm. He didn't say a single word. He simply walked from his table and positioned himself directly between Rachel and Kevin. He was a wall of silent, immovable power. He looked down at her ex, his whiskey-colored eyes turning hard and cold as stone. The sheer, unadulterated menace rolling off him was a physical force. Kevin, who had been puffing out his chest a moment before, seemed to shrink. He took one look at the man in the perfectly tailored suit, at the promise of swift, brutal violence in those cold eyes, and he visibly deflated. He stammered something incoherent, took a step back, and then another, before turning and practically fleeing from the shop, the bell on the door chiming his panicked retreat. The entire shop was silent. Rachel was trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. James turned to her, the murderous look in his eyes softening as he took in her pale, frightened face. He reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on the counter. His touch was warm, steady, a silent transfer of strength. "No one hurts you while I'm here," he said, his voice a low, absolute vow. That night, the black car did not take her to her own apartment building. It drove to a part of the city she had never been to, stopping before a discreet, elegant residential building. "You're staying here tonight," James said as he led her inside. It wasn't a suggestion or a seduction. It was a statement of necessity. His hand rested on the small of her back, a protective, non-negotiable presence. "He won't find you here." The elevator opened directly into his apartment, and the first thing that struck Rachel was the silence. It was a deep, profound quiet that seemed to absorb all sound. The second thing was the emptiness. The space was vast, a sprawling open-plan living area with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking, panoramic view of the city. The furniture was exquisite, minimalist, and looked as though it had never been touched. A sleek black leather sofa, a glass coffee table, a few abstract paintings on the stark white walls. It was less a home and more a high-end furniture showroom, a beautiful but sterile display of wealth. There were no photographs on the walls, no stacks of books on the tables, no personal trinkets, no clutter, no sign of a life actually being lived. It was the apartment of a ghost, a man who occupied a space without ever truly inhabiting it. The loneliness of the place was a physical presence, a cold ache in the air that mirrored the loneliness she saw in his eyes. "The guest room is this way," he said, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. He led her down a long, white hallway. "You'll be safe here. The building has its own security. No one gets in without my approval." He opened a door to a room that was just as beautiful and impersonal as the rest of the apartment. A large bed with crisp white linens, an ensuite bathroom stocked with expensive unopened toiletries. It was a luxury hotel suite, not a guest room. It was designed for visitors, not for family. "Thank you," she said, her voice small. He stood in the doorway, a chasm of unspoken words between them. The protector was back, but the man who had touched her hand with such warmth in the coffee shop was gone, replaced by the cool, distant host. "My room is at the other end of the hall," he stated, a clear, deliberate drawing of a boundary. "If you need anything, just call." He turned to leave, but hesitated. "Rachel," he said, his back still to her. "What he said? In the shop. You don't owe him anything." And then he was gone, his footsteps silent on the polished hardwood floor, leaving her alone in the beautiful, empty room. She realized that while he had brought her into his physical space to protect her, he was still keeping her a world away from his real life. Sleep did not come easily. She lay in the unfamiliar bed, the silence of the apartment pressing in on her. Sometime in the deep, dark hours of the morning, a sound drifted down the hallway, pulling her from a light, restless doze. It was a voice, thick with sleep and pain, a low, agonized murmur, a nightmare. She sat up, her heart pounding. A part of her knew she should stay put, respect the boundary he had drawn so clearly. But another, stronger part, the part that had seen the profound loneliness in his eyes, couldn't ignore the sound of his pain. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet cold on the floor, and crept down the long, dark hallway toward his room. The door was slightly ajar. The murmuring was clearer now, the words choked and desperate. "Leo, I'm sorry. Leo, no." The name was a raw, open wound in the darkness. Pushing the door open a little wider, she peered inside. In the dim light filtering through the windows, she could see him. He was tangled in his sheets, his head thrashing on the pillow, his face a mask of torment. He was trapped in a hell she couldn't see. "James," she whispered, stepping into the room. He bolted upright at the sound of her voice, his eyes flying open. He was awake instantly, the nightmare clinging to him like a shroud. For a single, unguarded second, she saw it all. The raw fear, the gut-wrenching grief, the vulnerability of a man completely broken. Then, just as quickly, the walls slammed back into place. The control, the armor, the mask of the dawn, it was all there. He looked at her, his eyes turning hard and cold, furious at her for witnessing his weakness. "Who's Leo?" she asked softly, her voice full of a compassion he clearly didn't want. The question hung in the air, a forbidden key to a locked room. A muscle in his jaw tightened. "Someone I failed to protect," he said, his voice flat and cold as ice. "Now go back to bed." The door to his heart, the one she had felt him begin to open, had just been slammed shut and bolted. And she was left on the outside, in the cold, with more questions and a deeper ache than ever before. The next morning, a fragile, unspoken truce existed between them. The shared, stolen moment of the nightmare was a ghost in the room, unacknowledged but ever present. James was polite, distant, his armor firmly back in place. He had a car take her to her shift at the hospital, the silent transaction feeling like a retreat, a return to their established roles of protector and protected. During a lull in her shift, Rachel was scrolling through the local news on her phone when a headline made her freeze. Her ex-boyfriend, Kevin, had been arrested in the early hours of the morning. The article cited a string of outstanding warrants for petty theft and assault, charges the police had suddenly decided to act upon after receiving an anonymous tip. It wasn't a coincidence. She knew it with a bone-deep certainty. The timing was too perfect, the resolution too neat. This was James. This was his silent, brutal efficiency at work. A cold shiver traced its way down her spine. It was one thing to see him intimidate a man in a coffee shop. It was another entirely to know he could pull strings and ruin a life with a single, untraceable phone call. That evening, when he came to pick her up from the hospital himself, she confronted him before she even got in the car. "Kevin was arrested," she said, her arms crossed over her chest, her voice a mixture of accusation and a fear she hated to admit. "What did you do?" He didn't even have the grace to feign surprise. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable in the deepening twilight. "I made sure justice followed its proper course," he said, his voice calm and even. "He had outstanding warrants. I merely ensured the authorities were reminded of them." He opened the car door for her. "He won't be bothering you again." The terrifying, absolute finality in his voice sent another chill through her. She got into the car, her mind reeling. She should have been horrified, and a part of her was, but a larger, more honest part of her felt a profound, intoxicating sense of relief. A sense of safety so complete it was like a drug. For the first time in years, she didn't have to look over her shoulder. The monster from her past had been dealt with, swiftly and permanently. As they drove in silence, her personal phone rang. It was her mother, her voice giddy with an excitement Rachel hadn't heard in years. "You won't believe it, honey," her mother gushed. The hospital called. Westwood. They said your grandmother has responded so well to Dr. Finch's initial treatment that they're offering her a spot in a new long-term rehabilitation program. It's a 6-month inpatient program, the best in the country. And Rachel, they said it's all been taken care of, paid in full by an anonymous benefactor. The phone felt slick in Rachel's hand. She looked from the passing city lights to the man sitting beside her in the silent car. He was staring straight ahead, his handsome profile a mask of indifference, but she knew. It was him. It was all him. He was a phantom, moving through the background of her life, silently, systematically, fixing every broken thing. He was eliminating her fears, paving her future, solving problems she hadn't even known how to articulate. "I didn't ask you to do any of this," she said, her voice choked with a confusing storm of gratitude, resentment, and awe. She felt like she was drowning in his influence, her own life no longer her own. He finally turned his head to look at her, his dark eyes capturing hers in the dim light of the car. "You didn't have to ask," he replied, his voice a low, soft rumble. He reached over, his hand covering hers for a brief, warm moment. "I take care of what's mine." The word hung in the air between them, heavy and possessive. Mine. It was a claim, a brand. It was the most terrifying and the most comforting word she had ever heard. Was she being saved, or was she being owned? And was there even a difference anymore? The word mine echoed in Rachel's head for the rest of the drive, a possessive claim that both thrilled and terrified her. When they arrived back at his silent, empty apartment, she knew she couldn't let it go. This was a precipice, a moment where the unspoken rules of their arrangement had to be defined, or she would lose herself completely in his powerful orbit. As he set his keys on a glass console table, she turned to face him, her heart hammering but her resolve firm. "I am not yours." The words, spoken quietly into the vast stillness of the room, had the force of a physical blow. She saw him flinch, a subtle, almost imperceptible tightening of his shoulders. A shuttered, unreadable expression fell over his face, the warmth from the car gone, replaced by a cold, impenetrable mask. He didn't argue. He didn't respond. He simply gave her a curt, dismissive nod and walked away, retreating to his office and closing the door behind him, leaving her alone in the echoing silence. For 2 days, he was a ghost. He was physically present in the apartment, but emotionally, he was a million miles away. He treated her with a chilling, distant politeness that was more painful than any argument. He spoke to her only when necessary, his voice flat and formal. The silent, watchful protector was gone, replaced by a cold, courteous stranger who shared his roof, but nothing else. The absence of his intensity, the lack of that focused, burning attention, left a void that was a constant, hollow ache in her chest. She had pushed him away, and now she was adrift in the cold, lonely space she had created. She missed him. The realization was as terrifying as it was undeniable. On the 3rd night, she couldn't stand it anymore. She found him where she knew he would be, in the rooftop garden, his sanctuary. He was standing at the edge of the terrace, staring out at the city, a solitary figure against the glittering skyline. "James," she said softly. He didn't turn. "You should be inside. It's cold out here." "I'm sorry," she said, walking to stand beside him, though she kept a careful distance. He finally looked at her, his eyes guarded. "I'm not sorry for what I said," she clarified, her voice trembling slightly. "But I'm sorry for how I said it. I was scared. You're fixing everything, and I don't know how to feel about it." Her honesty seemed to breach his defenses. He let out a long, weary sigh, the sound full of a pain that seemed ancient. He turned his gaze back to the city below. "You have every right to be scared," he said, his voice low and rough. He was silent for a long moment, and she thought that was all he would say. But then he began to speak, and he finally told her the story of the ghost that haunted him. He told her about Leo, his younger brother, not by blood, but by a bond forged in the streets, closer than any blood tie. Leo was bright, reckless, and the only person in the world who could make James laugh. A few years ago, a rival, Marcus Thorne, had seen Leo as a weakness, a pawn to be used against James. Thorne's men had cornered Leo, trying to intimidate him, to turn him. But Leo was loyal. The confrontation had escalated. Leo had fought back, and he had been killed. "I was too late," James said, his voice cracking, the sound a raw, open wound in the quiet of the garden. "I was 5 minutes too late. I got there, and he was gone. I swore on his grave that I would never again fail to protect someone I care about, that I would never be too late again." He finally turned to look at her, and the raw, unshielded agony in his eyes stole her breath. "When I saw you in that restaurant so strong and so alone, when I saw that bastard put his hands on you in the coffee shop, it was like seeing Leo all over again, another good person about to be devoured by the wolves." In that moment, she didn't see a mafia boss. She didn't see a powerful, intimidating man. She saw a boy still grieving his brother, a man so shattered by guilt that he had built an empire around himself to ensure he would never feel that helpless again. Acting on pure instinct, she closed the distance between them. She reached up, her hand trembling, and gently cupped his face, her thumb stroking the hard line of his jaw. "You're not alone in this, James," she whispered. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into her touch, a profound, shuddering sigh escaping his lips. He closed his eyes, a silent surrender, allowing her comfort to breach the walls he had so carefully constructed. The final barrier between them, the one built of secrets and guilt, was about to crumble into dust. He opened his eyes. The raw, unguarded pain she saw there was a dark, bottomless ocean, and she was falling into it. His hand came up to cover hers where it rested on his cheek, his skin warm against her own. His thumb traced the line of her wrist, a touch so gentle it was almost reverent. "You don't know what you're getting into, Rachel," he whispered, his voice a rough, broken thing. It was a warning, a last desperate attempt to push her away, to save her from the darkness that clung to him like a second skin. "My world, it will destroy you." She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She held his gaze, her own clear and unwavering. His confession hadn't scared her. It had unlocked him. For the first time, she saw the why behind his every action. The control, the protection, the silent watchfulness. It was all a fortress built around the empty space where his brother used to be. "Then show me," she replied, her voice soft but laced with a strength that surprised them both. "Stop protecting me from your world, James, and let me into it." Her words, her acceptance of his darkness, her refusal to be scared away, it was the one thing he had no defense against. It shattered the last of his iron-willed control. A low groan, a sound of pure, agonized surrender was torn from his throat. He pulled her to him, his other hand tangling in her hair, tilting her head back. His mouth crashed down on hers. It was not a kiss of gentle romance. It was a kiss of starvation. It was the desperate, frantic collision of two lonely, broken souls. It was years of solitude, of guilt, of a tightly controlled world, all unraveling in a single, cataclysmic moment. His lips were demanding, hungry, trying to draw the very life from her, as if she were the only source of light in his endless night. It was overwhelming, and it was everything. A fire ignited deep within Rachel, a blaze of her own pent-up longing and a fierce, desperate need to heal the man who was breaking before her. She didn't just receive his kiss. She met it with an equal, startling ferocity. Her arms wrapped around his neck, her fingers gripping his shoulders as she pulled him closer, answering his desperation with her own. This wasn't a choice. It was a chemical reaction, an inevitability, a truth their bodies had known long before their minds were willing to accept it. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathless, their chests heaving. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, the scent of rain and cedar and him enveloping her. The silence of the garden rushed back in, filled with the sound of their ragged breathing. "This changes everything," he rasped, his voice thick with the aftershock of the kiss. He opened his eyes, and the intensity in them was a brand. "You're not just a bystander anymore. Now, you're a target, just as much as I am." Before she could process his words, before she could tell him that she didn't care, his phone, the sleek, dangerous one, vibrated in his pocket. The sound was a violent intrusion, a harsh reminder of the world waiting for them outside the sanctuary of the garden. With a curse, he pulled it out, his eyes never leaving hers. He answered it, his thumb swiping across the screen. "What?" He listened, and she watched as every ounce of warmth, every trace of the vulnerable man who had just kissed her, was instantly erased. His body went rigid, the hand not holding the phone clenched into a fist at his side. The Don was back, his face a mask of cold, lethal fury. "Where?" he growled. He listened for another second, his jaw tight. "I'm on my way." He ended the call, his gaze still locked on her, but now it held a new, terrifying urgency. "We have a problem," he said, his voice flat and deadly. "Thorn, he knows about you." The words, "Thorn knows about you," landed like a death sentence in the quiet sanctuary of the garden. The fragile, beautiful intimacy of their kiss evaporated, replaced by a sudden, chilling fear. The world James had tried to shield her from was no longer at the gate. It was battering down the door. James's protective instinct flared, immediate and absolute. He stepped back, his mind already calculating threats, escape routes, and safe houses. The lover was gone, consumed by the protector. "I need to get you out of the city," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. "I have a place in the mountains. It's completely off the grid. You'll be safe there until I handle this." He was already turning, ready to make the call, to set the wheels of her escape in motion. But Rachel didn't move. "No." The word was quiet, but it stopped him cold. He turned back to her, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. "Rachel, you don't understand," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "Thorn is not a man who makes idle threats. He will come after you to get to me. This is not a game." "I know it's not a game," she shot back, a fire she didn't know she possessed igniting in her veins. "I've spent my entire life running from my ex, running from bills, running from the fear of my grandmother getting sicker. I'm tired of being the frightened little bird, James." She took a step toward him, her chin lifted in defiance. "You didn't save me just so I could be hidden away in a cage, no matter how safe it is. I'm not going anywhere." He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time, not as someone to be protected, but as a force in her own right. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw a core of steel beneath it. Her refusal to be a damsel in distress, her choice to stand her ground in the face of a threat that would make most people crumble, impressed him more than anything else had. A slow, dangerous smile touched his lips. "All right," he said, his entire strategy shifting in that instant. "But if you're staying, you're not staying as a target. You're staying as a player. You will learn to defend yourself." He didn't take her to a shooting range or a self-defense class. He took her to a place that looked like a high-tech corporate office, a threat analysis center, as he called it. For the next few days, he didn't teach her how to fight. He taught her how to see. He taught her his world. He showed her how to read a room, how to spot the person who doesn't belong, how to notice the subtle shift in a person's posture that signals a threat. He taught her to use her intelligence, her quiet powers of observation, as a weapon more potent than any gun. During one session, he had her standing in the center of a room while holographic projections of a crowded gala moved around them. "Find the threat," he commanded. She scanned the virtual crowd, her senses on high alert. The waiter, she said finally. His uniform is immaculate, but his shoes are scuffed. Military issue. And he's watching the exits, not the guests. James's voice was a low murmur of approval from right behind her. Good. He moved closer, his body a warm, solid presence at her back, his hand guiding her chin to a different part of the room. Now look again. What else do you see? His proximity was a dizzying distraction. His scent enveloped her, and the heat from his body made it hard to think. Her focus on the holographic crowd wavered, replaced by an intense awareness of the man standing inches away. The first rule of survival, Rachel, he whispered, his breath warm against her ear, his voice a low, intimate rumble that sent a shiver down her spine, is to never take your eyes off the target. She turned her head to look at him, her lips just a breath away from his. But right now, he continued, his own gaze dropping to her mouth, his voice growing thick, you're the only thing I can see. The message from Thorne arrived not as a threat, but as a formal invitation. A dinner he proposed at one of his own upscale restaurants. A meeting to discuss a peaceful resolution. The final line of the invitation was the real message, a stiletto blade wrapped in silk. And please, do bring the lovely Rachel. I feel we have so much more to talk about. It was a demand, not a request. A clear signal that he intended to use her as leverage. Absolutely not, James said, his voice a low, furious growl as he read the message on his phone. I'll arrange a meeting on my own terms. He won't get within 100 feet of you. He was already pacing, his mind working, planning an ambush, a countermove. No, James, Rachel said, her voice calm and steady. She had been expecting this. She had been preparing for it. He wants to use me as bait? Then that's exactly what we'll let him do. James stopped pacing and stared at her as if she had lost her mind. Don't be ridiculous. I'm not putting you in that kind of danger. It's not ridiculous. It's strategic, she argued, her voice gaining confidence as she laid out the plan that had been forming in her mind. He'll be on his home turf. He'll be arrogant, overconfident. He'll be expecting me to be a terrified, weeping mess he can use to control you. He won't see me coming. He won't see me as a threat. She looked him directly in the eye. It's the perfect trap. He hated it. Every protective instinct in his body screamed against it. But he couldn't deny the cold, hard logic in her plan. She would be the one weapon in his arsenal that Thorne would completely underestimate. The debate was fierce, but her resolve was absolute. You taught me how to be strong, she said finally, her voice softening as she placed a hand on his arm. Now you have to trust me to use it. Trust your student. His jaw was tight, but he saw the steel in her eyes and knew he could not change her mind. He gave a single sharp nod of assent, his expression grim. The next night, Rachel walked into Thorne's restaurant. She was alone. The dress she wore was simple and elegant, but underneath, her heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. A tiny, almost invisible microphone was hidden in a delicate necklace, and a small earpiece was nestled in her ear, her only connection to the man who was watching from an unmarked van across the street. The restaurant was a sea of hostile faces. She could feel the eyes of Thorne's men on her as the hostess led her to a secluded table in the back. She sat down, her hands trembling slightly as she placed her napkin in her lap. Then, a voice, low and steady, filled her ear. It was James. I'm here, Rachel. I can see you. You're not alone. His voice was a lifeline in the tense, suffocating atmosphere. It was a shield of calm around her racing heart. Just breathe, he continued, his voice a soothing, constant presence. Remember what I taught you. Scan the room. Who's watching you? Who's pretending not to? She took a slow, deep breath, his voice grounding her. She lifted her head, her gaze sweeping the room with a newfound purpose. She was not a victim waiting for the slaughter. She was the bait in a trap of her own design. and the hunter was about to walk right into it. Marcus Thorne approached her table, his movements slow and triumphant, like a predator savoring the final moments before a kill. A smug, self-satisfied smile was plastered on his face. He sat down opposite her, his presence oily and suffocating. "Well, well," he purred, his eyes raking over her with a look of ownership. "I see the lion finally let his little canary out of her cage. I'm flattered you came alone." Rachel forced her hands to remain steady in her lap. She met his gaze, allowing a flicker of fear, real but controlled, to show in her eyes. "James doesn't know I'm here," she lied, her voice a convincing, tremulous whisper. "I came because I want this to stop. I want my life back." "Good, Rachel," James's voice murmured in her ear, a ghost of encouragement. "Keep him talking. Keep him focused on you." She played her part perfectly. She was the frightened, desperate woman, caught between two powerful men, willing to do anything for a chance at peace. She fed Thorne the carefully constructed pieces of false information James had prepared for her. Details about a new shipping route, a weakness in his security, lies that were just plausible enough to be believed. Thorne drank it all in, his ego swelling with every word, convinced he had successfully turned James's greatest treasure against him. "I knew you were a smart girl," he said, leaning back in his chair, basking in his perceived victory. "Come with me. We can finalize our new arrangement in my office." This was it, the final move. "He's taking her to the back," she heard James say to his team through the earpiece, his voice tight with controlled tension. "Positions, now." Thorne led her through a door disguised as a wine cellar into a lavish, soundproof office. The moment the heavy door clicked shut, his triumphant smile turned into a cruel, victorious sneer. "You've been very helpful, my dear. James will be so disappointed when he learns his little bird flew right into my hand." It was the signal. The office door burst open. But it wasn't James. It was two of his men, moving with silent, brutal efficiency. They had entered through a service corridor Rachel had identified from the building's blueprints, a route Thorne had overlooked. At the same time, the main restaurant entrance was breached. It was a perfectly executed pincer movement. Thorne stared, his face a mask of disbelief. He had been so focused on the front door, so sure of his control, that he had been completely outmaneuvered. But as James himself stepped into the office, his face cold as stone, Thorne revealed his last, desperate card. He laughed, a wild, unhinged sound, and held up a small remote detonator. A single red light blinked ominously. "You may have my men, Marino, but you don't have the building," he crowed. "The entire foundation is wired with explosives. I press this button, and we all go down together. 60 seconds on the clock." James froze. His eyes darted from Thorne to the detonator to Rachel. He was trapped. But Thorne had made the same mistake everyone else had. He had underestimated Rachel. While the two men were locked in their standoff, her eyes were scanning the room, just as James had taught her. Her gaze landed on a large, ornate painting behind Thorne's desk. The canvas was slightly askew, and behind it, she could see the corner of a gray metal panel, a hastily concealed junction box for the building's wiring. While Thorne's attention was locked on James, Rachel moved. In one swift, fluid motion, she lunged for the painting, ripping it from the wall. She yanked open the panel door and, without a second's hesitation, grabbed the thick bundle of wires inside and tore them out with all her strength. Sparks flew. The small red light on Thorne's detonator flickered once, then died. Thorne stared at the dead device in his hand, then at her, his face a perfect picture of stunned, absolute shock. He had never even considered her a player in the game. That single second of distraction was all James needed. He moved like a viper, closing the distance and disarming Thorne with a swift, brutal efficiency that left the man gasping on the floor. His reign of terror over, James stood over his defeated rival, his chest heaving. He then turned to Rachel, who stood amidst the sparking wires, her heart pounding with a wild, triumphant adrenaline. He looked at her, not with the relief of a man who had saved his lover, but with the profound, stunned respect of a king who had just been saved by his queen. 6 months later. The afternoon sun streamed into a bustling, renovated kitchen, glinting off stainless steel and illuminating the steam rising from a dozen simmering pots. The air was alive with the sense of fresh herbs, roasting garlic, and the sweet aroma of success. Rachel stood at the pass, a chef's coat crisp and white over her clothes, meticulously adding a final garnish to a plate. She was not an employee. She was the consulting chef, the creative mind behind the new menu. The restaurant, the very same one where her nightmare had begun, had been completely transformed. A new, elegant sign hung above the door, bearing the name she had chosen, the Sanctuary. At a quiet corner table, her grandmother sat, looking healthier and more vibrant than she had in years. She took a bite of the dish Rachel had just sent out, her face breaking into a wide, joyous smile. Rachel's life was no longer about survival. It was about creation, passion, and a deep, quiet joy she had never thought possible. She was not just living, she was thriving. The front door opened, and James walked in. The room no longer fell silent at his arrival. The staff, who had come to know him not as a feared entity, but as Chef Rachel's partner, greeted him with warm, respectful nods. He was still a man of immense power, but here, in her world, he was simply James. He bypassed the hostess stand, his eyes scanning the room until they found her in the bustling kitchen. He walked straight to her, ignoring everyone else, his gaze soft and full of a pride that made her heart swell. He came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest, unconcerned by the controlled chaos of the kitchen around them. He rested his chin on her shoulder, breathing in the scent of her, a mixture of lavender and spices. "Happy?" he whispered in her ear, his voice a low, contented rumble. She turned in his arms, her hands coming up to cup his face. She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. "More than happy," she said. "I'm home." She leaned in and kissed him, a sweet, lingering kiss filled with the easy intimacy of a shared life. It was a kiss of partnership, of love that had been tested by fire and had emerged stronger. When she pulled back, he kept her close, his expression turning serious. "I have something for you," he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. For a heart-stopping second, she thought it was a ring, but when he opened it, there was no diamond. Inside, nestled on the dark velvet, was a single, ornate, old-fashioned key. "It's the key to my apartment," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Which is now our apartment." He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. "No more guest rooms, Rachel. No more separate hallways. Just one home. Our home." Tears welled in her eyes as she took the key from the box. It was heavier than she expected, a solid, tangible symbol of his final, complete surrender. It was not a chain. It was an invitation. It was the ultimate act of trust. The key not just to his home, but to the last, most heavily guarded room of his heart. She closed her hand around it, the cool metal warming against her skin. Together, they turned to look out at the bustling dining room, at the place where a declined credit card and a moment of public humiliation had, by some miracle of fate, led them both to their sanctuary.